You are listening to the Prepared Warrior Podcast, where law enforcement and military trainers discuss cutting-edge training, tactics, and technology. Here is your host, John Wilson.
You are listening to Season 2, Episode 3 of the Prepared Warrior. Our guest for this episode is Morgan Ballis. I like to start every episode with a quote. This one is from Tiger Woods, who said, "No matter how good you get, you can always get better." And that's the exciting part. On today's episode of the Prepared Warrior Podcast, I have a special guest, Morgan Ballis. Now, he was an infantry unit leader in the United States Marine Corps with multiple combat deployments, now a founding partner, director of strategic planning and training with DMB Consultants, an emergency management consulting firm based out of San Diego, California, specializing in K-12 facilities with an emphasis on active shooter response. Thanks so much for coming on, Morgan.
John, thank you so much for having me.
Now, first, get a little more background. How did you go from the Marines to getting involved in doing research and training to help law enforcement and others with active shooter response?
Yeah, so in the Marines, I was an infantryman. Spent some time on recruiting duty, and obviously, part of my duties were not just training my Marines, but also training foreign nationals as well. So I've always had a strong basis in training and tactics, enemy analysis, infrastructure assessments, things of that nature. But really, what happened for me was in 2011. There was the Congresswoman Gabrielle Gifford shooting in Tucson, Arizona.
Right.
And I'm actually from Tucson. I was home on recruiting duty at the time. And my mom was actually there during the shooting. She survived the shooting. She happened to be between a pillar and where the shooter was. So she wasn't injured directly. But when the incident occurred, she was at the table pretty much right next to Gabrielle Gifford's.
Wow.
Once the shooting stopped, she actually would go on to save the life of Ron Barber, who would end up being our congressman in that district. Ironically enough, I actually went to school with the shooter. I didn't know him personally. He was 2 years behind me in high school. But really that event, I started to ask myself a lot of questions. What do I know as a Marine? What are the tactics and training? Would they have applied? Is it a completely different context? And it was that event that really kind of catapulted me down this journey that I'm on now to becoming an expert specifically in active shooter response to K-12 facilities. And the reason that emphasis is there for me, not only because I'm a father, but my wife's an educator. She works in elementary schools, and she would ask me questions, or what does your research say, or what are you seeing as a result of these different incidents? And I thought, you know what, I have the opportunity to take my passion and really apply it to this field. And that's where we focus our efforts at.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. So it just hit you so hard on a personal level, and you've, I guess, been on kind of a fact-finding mission ever since to improve training for that kind of specific incident.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things that even struck me more was, here I was a combat veteran of multiple tours to Iraq, specifically Ramadi, Iraq. And here I was counseling my mom on PTSD and survivor's guilt and, the challenges that come after traumatic events, self-medication, things of that nature, things that, line officers experience and emergency personnel experience as well, and just trying to help my mom deal with those things and build that resiliency. I never imagined even having those conversations with my mom.
Wow. So we came into contact at ILETA, the International Law Enforcement Educators and Trainers Association conference and expo this year, and you spoke on a panel about active shooter incidents. How did that go for you?
That was an incredible experience. Our original presentation was called Beyond Run, Hide, Fight. So we were looking at the empirical data specific to K-12 schools on what are we seeing in terms of the resolution of these events, where they're taking place, where is the actual attack materializing, how long do these attacks occur, what do the response times look like. And following my original presentation, I presented on 2 days one of the board members that was on the active shooter panel that ran the panel, a gentleman by the name of Don, he invited me to sit on the active shooter panel. And it was an incredible experience, not just to have the honor to sit on the panel, but to be able to provide insight into the specifics of school active assailant events, because the majority of the panel were made up of current or prior law enforcement, talking about the generalities of school active shooters. So we provided that specific insight for them.
And did you learn anything interesting from some of the other presenters on that panel?
I think from the conference as a whole, what's unique about the circumstances surrounding ILETA and those instructors that attend is we're all lifelong learners. And there's so many different areas that you can learn in, from curriculum development to actual tactics and trainings and armor courses. So to be there with a group of lifelong learners, everyone's open-minded and really trying to find solutions to these dynamic challenges, it was just an amazing experience. In terms of the panel themselves, just some great insights really into the different types of active shooter events. For example, how terrorist attacks and those mass murder events are resolved versus attacks against businesses. Or if we're looking at very specific incidents, such as the active shooter incident in Dallas, where really for the first time we saw law enforcement being the specific target of those attacks, was just incredible to get some behind the scenes insight. And even details from officers that were at the scene or even responded to some of these national incidents and understand some dynamics that aren't generally made aware to the public was a phenomenal experience. I mean, other board panel members included John Farnham, Masada Ayu, guys that are just idols of mine, guys that in the industry are absolute legends, and here I am sitting next to them. Was just a phenomenal experience, and there were so many good takeaways.
So specifically, what were you able to present? I mean, it's what you've been working on, the empirical data, and what it tells us about school active shooter events. So how does that compare to other mass killing incidents based on the data you've researched?
So what we see consistently with school active assailant events is a phenomenally higher casualty rate, and that's both in the number wounded and the number killed. Data shows us anywhere from 1-to-1 to almost 1-to-2, depending on what you're looking at, victims that are killed versus one wounded. So for every one victim killed, there will be one wounded, which is just completely different outside of other crimes in general, but even mass murder incidents that we're seeing. And so as I started to look at the data, I wanted to figure out why that was happening. What were the circumstances that were so unique to schools? Was there any one thing, or was it a totality of the circumstances that caused such tremendous fatality rates within these incidents? And we're looking specifically at data presented by the FBI. They have 3 different reports out from 2000 to 2013, 14 to 15, and then 16 to 17. This information is also provided through ALERT, which is the Advanced Law Enforcement Emergency Response Training. They're out of the Texas University, or University of Texas is where Texas State University is actually where they're from. So we're looking at all these years combined, almost the past 2 decades, and we're trying to figure out what is the median or the average time of response, the time that these things are occurring, and the casualties. And some of the key aspects that we're finding is that in terms of planning, there's a lot of planning that goes on, and the U.S. Department of Education and the United States Secret Service produced a joint report back in 2004. They've done subsequent reports specifically looking at active shooters, or what they call targeted attacks in schools. And we know that there's a tremendous amount of planning that happens. Not only that is there a tremendous amount of planning that occurs, but also there's opportunities for those attackers to conduct rehearsals every single day.
Right.
Every single day that they walk the halls with their future victims, they're able to plan out every aspect of their attack, where that attack is going to have the greatest consequences. We see a lot of times there is actually a specific victim or victims in mind. A lot of times that does happen to be a staff member. So, hey, am I going to start the shooting in this class with this teacher that failed me, or that, the principal that suspended me, and then where am I going to carry on that attack? So that's a key aspect to understanding what's unique about school active shooter events, because traditionally we've looked at a lockdown response. And lockdown was never created in response to school active shooter events as we know them today. It was meant for a threat that materialized outside of our safe space. It wasn't meant to combat a threat that actually started shooting right inside of my classroom. So that's a key component of the data that we're looking at. The other key components that we're looking at are the timelines of the attack. Somewhere close to 60% of these incidents are ending in 2 to 5 minutes. So what that also means is that our ability to warn the campus and alert them to the threat needs to take priority over other things, such as contacting police to get the response there. Because if we now compare the timeline of these events compared to law enforcement response, you're looking at anywhere from 6 to 12 minutes for law enforcement to respond. The challenge with kind of honing in on law enforcement response is there's so many different definitions or variables that are out there. Some law enforcement might say, yes, we responded in terms of we sent units. We put the call out to units that they need to respond. Others will say we're at location. Others will say that we've made entry, or we've actually made contact or neutralized a threat. So it's challenging to hone in on that specific timeline. But from the data available, you're looking at anywhere from 6 to 12 minutes before you have officers actually in the building actively trying to engage and seek out that threat.
Okay, so the data is showing, the faster response, obviously, the better, the faster they can get in the building, as opposed to the standard lockdown. So what for someone who, say, is a student or a staff member in the school, how should they, kind of decide what to do if lockdown might not be, the best option?
Right, and it's not that lockdown isn't a viable option. The challenge is that post-Columbine, lockdown became the primary response. And the problem with focusing on lockdown as a primary response is it's just not aligned to the actual threat that's presented. Creating a safe space or layering your safe space, such as what someone might do in a lockdown situation, is definitely a great option if the threat is down the hall, or if you're not sure where the threat is, but they haven't gained entry into your safe space. So it's just important to understand that we're not advocating for taking that off the table. Mm-hmm. It's just we need to ensure stakeholders understand all the options that are available to them. One of the things that guide us in helping to understand why options are important is, again, we jump back into the data and we look at how are these attacks actually resolved? What ends the threat? And what we see is anywhere from, again, depending on what study you're looking, or if you're looking at the kind of average, it's anywhere from 20 upwards of 40% of school active salient events are actually ended by unarmed staff, teachers, principals, or even students that make the very personal choice to fight or counter or resist the attacker when the opportunity makes itself available. So it's important to understand that if someone's in your safe space and you make that personal choice, that's definitely an option that stakeholders have in order to end the threat. And they're consistently successful in ending that threat. If we're looking now at police response, when they arrived and the threat is still present, and that only happens somewhere around 40% of the time, nearly 60% of these, or even more, some studies show, I believe alerts data shows upwards of 68% of these incidents are actually ended before law enforcement even arrives. When law enforcement does make contact with the suspect at school, they're only shooting to stop the threat in 7% of these cases. Less than 10% is law enforcement actively engaging the threat to stop it. So it becomes important to really understand everything that stakeholders can do to help them survive that next 5, 6, or 10 minutes of that attack before either the threat is ended or law enforcement is able to get to those victims.
Right.
The other big way that the threat is ending, of course, is self-termination, and that's happening if you look at a combined both pre and post law enforcement response. That is happening anywhere from 45 to 50% of the time. But we also have to dive deeper and say, okay, when are these attackers deciding to self-terminate? And there's really 3 instances that we consistently see when the data is available. The first is there's no more victims, or there's the perception of no more victims. So they enter 1 or 2 classrooms. They've killed, or they believe they've killed, as many people as possible in there. The rest of the school maybe by this time has had the opportunity to establish an effective lockdown, and then they decide to self-terminate. The other time is when they believe they're going to be taken into custody. So maybe they hear sirens, or maybe they have made visual contact with officers outside the building. So they don't want to be taken into custody, so they self-terminate. And then the third reason that they decide to self-terminate is they've met active resistance. And we see this time and time again where either law enforcement's on scene and they're either verbally or physically engaging the suspect, or even stakeholders, teachers, are standing up and resisting. And that attacker believes that they're not going to win that fight, so they decide to self-terminate. And the attack in New Zealand is a great example of this. At the second mosque, it wasn't a good guy with a gun, which obviously would have helped to permanently end the threat, but it was an individual who picked up a credit card reader and threw it at the assailant, who's heavily armed with shotgun and a rifle. And it was that simple act of resistance that actually caused that suspect to flee and eventually ended that threat.
As part of your presentation at ILETA, you talked about the history of lockdown. Could you kind of give us a bit of a summary of the history of lockdown as a response to these active shooter events?
Yeah, absolutely. So with lockdown really came about post-Columbine, when we were trying to find the best solution, where we didn't really have any solution to these horrific crimes in schools. And the purpose of lockdown is to isolate users from the active assailant, to be able to prevent that assailant from gaining access to more victims. The challenge with lockdown, or the problem with lockdown, it was actually never created for the type of threat that we're seeing today. The most thorough research into the origins of lockdown was conducted by Lieutenant Joseph Henry Jr. Through the Alice Institute. And he actually put out, they have a great document of this on their website called The Origins of Lockdown. And in his research in 2009, he was trying to track back, where did this actually come from? Why is this considered the best practice of what we should do? And what he was able to do is he was able to actually track it back to the 1970s, to Southern California, what possibly looks like Los Angeles Unified School District. And in the 70s, what we have is a lot of gang-related crime, and a specific tactic used by gangs, of course, is drive-by shootings. So the schools in the region were trying to find a solution to keep their students and staff safe during these drive-by shootings, and they developed what is now known as lockdown. Essentially, at the time, it was a reverse fire drill, or some districts even referred to them as drive-by drills, where the threat is outside of your perimeter. They really have no intention of gaining entry into your perimeter. And what you want to do is you want to get everyone back inside as quickly as possible, because the building provides the best cover and protection for your stakeholders. Well, as part of lockdown, what you do, of course, is you close the blinds. And if you remember back in the day from school, these aren't blinds as we know them today. These are those big, thick curtains. And what closing the curtains did is it offered another layer of protection. If that projectile did penetrate the window, then you're able to reduce fragmentation or that breaking glass. The curtain would essentially contain it. Another thing you would do as part of these procedures is you would turn off the lights. You would turn off the lights because if you have a big curtain and a light behind you, you're still producing a shadow. So it reduces target acquisition by turning off those lights. And then, of course, the most important thing you would do is you would get below that window frame in order to help protect the students and staff. There was really no requirement to lock the interior door, to barricade the door, or even to seek out a safe location in the room other than being below the windows, because the threat was not penetrating your safe space. And then what would happen is a lot of these schools already had law enforcement on staff within their perimeters. So they would provide the security internally, and then responding agencies would provide that external security. So the type of threat that lockdown was originally generated for does not match the type of threat that we are observing in active shooter incidents. And therefore, since 2013, the U.S. Department of Education and really every federal, state, and even local agency has supported an options-based response, which is now options. Users now have the options, for example, run, hide, fight, to choose what is best for them. It is a fluid response. You can choose any option at any time. And it is based off of the information that you have received. So to your best knowledge, based on the location of the shooter, you may decide to run. If you can't determine that, or if you do know where that shooter is, you can decide to lock down or hide. And then you can, if necessary, and as a last result, make the very personal decision to counter or fight that intruder.
So when police agencies are conducting training in their community for response to schools, active shooter events, what are some of the things they should avoid? Because I just saw recently there was a case in the news where people ended up complaining about being hurt during their training.
Absolutely. And what you're talking about the incident out of Tennessee, and it was a sheriff's department that was hosting an active shooter training. They were using the Alice system. I'm an Alice instructor. Alice has a great program. But what they did as part of their training is, in order to help get buy-in, what they did was they had teachers go into a room, and all they were allowed to do was lock down. And they shot the teachers with airsoft guns. And the purpose of that training method is to reinforce to them and to help them further understand that ducking cover or just getting under your desk or even playing dead, that you're at the complete mercy of that assailant and that it's not an effective strategy. They failed to realize who their audience was. Teachers don't need to be reminded of the consequences. At least in that respect, there was other ways of achieving that objective without introducing pain, without exposing the trainer and even the school district to risk, because now they're being sued. This is one of the things where as trainers we just really need to understand the difference between training in schools versus training in other environments where those techniques might have been appropriate. In this case, they weren't.
And we were talking about kind of the student and people, responding within, an institution. But what does the data say that law enforcement, how they should respond in cases, and what might be the best way to minimize damage?
Yeah, so when we look at the response for officers following Columbine, before Columbine, it was your traditional, we're going to cordon off the area and we're going to have SWAT come in to be able to end the threat. And of course, Columbine taught us that those tactics aren't effective, not just in schools, but really in any active killer situation. From there, what happened was we started to develop teams. So you would get into teams of 4, teams of 3, utilizing a diamond formation or other formations. And it was pretty much you waited until the first 4 officers got on scene. And then even with multiple agencies, you would then go in. Well, of course, we realized from that technique that it's not effective because we don't have enough time. Somewhere between 60 and 70% of all school active shooter incidents end within 2 to 5 minutes. The average police response is anywhere from 6 to 12 minutes. And people define response differently, being on scene versus making entry versus making contact. But essentially what we find is nearly 70% of all incidents have ended before law enforcement ever arrives. So those tactics of waiting for a team were obviously not effective, because by the time the team even showed up and got together to make entry, the threat had ended. So when we're looking at law enforcement response tactics, as time has changed over the years, there's really the big push for single officer entry. And as soon as you're on scene, you're making entry and you're really pushing to contact to try to end that threat as quickly as possible. The problem is we've given that more lip service than we have actual practice. And Marjorie Stoneman Douglas out of Florida is a great example of how on the surface we say, yes, we're going to make entry. Yes, we're encouraging officers to go in by themselves. But does our training actually reflect that? And as a nation, I would say that we're not there yet, but there is a huge push based off of the data and officers that have been involved in other incidents to make that a more standard practice.
With so many people being seriously injured in these events, I'm guessing another important aspect for responders to focus on could be just the general quickness of response, where they can get to potential victims and apply life-saving medical care?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great observation. So when we're looking at wounding patterns, especially in school active assailant events, it's a 1-to-1 killed to wounded ratio. So for every one person killed, there's likely to be one person wounded. Again, exponentially higher than other mass casualty incidents. Also, when we're looking at the threat and the response of victims, when you have a passive response, such as lockdown, you're completely at the mercy of that assailant. So when we're looking at wounding patterns, the primary weapon used is a firearm, specifically handguns and pistols are used more than any other type of firearm. But you're talking at almost contact distance, 2 to 3 feet. And then since you have a passive victim and you have an assailant who is trying to maximize the amount of casualties, specifically, we see an average of 2 to 3 gunshot wounds to the chest, head, and upper back. So when we're talking about the wounds where the victim could have survived, for example, a sucking chest wound, you have about a 10-minute window to get that individual to the next echelon of care. If we are waiting to respond as officers to end the threat, then that means that our emergency personnel, medical services, are also being delayed in that response. And this is going to be the hardest. There has to be a complete paradigm shift in the industry, especially among emergency personnel, to realize that we don't have time to wait in a holding area. We don't even have time to wait for what they call warm zones, where law enforcement has done a hasty clearing of an area, and now we're escorting emergency personnel to go and assess casualties. We don't even have time for that. You have 10 minutes to get those kids to the next level of care, and that clock started 5 minutes ago. So there has to be a real paradigm shift within law enforcement and emergency personnel to understand the dynamics of these situations. Beyond that, there's not been a single emergency personnel killed or wounded responding to a school active shooter event, and we're talking K-12 facilities. And to date, there's only been one officer, this was out of Santa Fe, who has been wounded in a K-12 school active shooter event. This is the easiest fight an officer will ever win. This person is not committed to the fight. They don't have the level of training. They don't have the confidence in their ability and their equipment. If we really look hard at these case studies, weapon stoppages or malfunctions consistently prevent the attacker from being able to achieve even higher amounts of casualties, because they're not trained. They're ineffective in their tactics and their techniques and their weapons manipulation. So time, not just in the duration of the attack, but also, like you stated, time in being able to get in there and start to assess casualties as well.
So the police responding should have a leg up on the attacker, right? As for the experience and weapon proficiency, but there's also the issue of whether there are secondary devices or maybe another assailant. But what does the data show? There are almost always committed by just a single person, right?
Yeah, typically in high percentile, it's going to be a single assailant, overwhelmingly male. When we're talking about K-12 facilities, 16 to like 22, and normally on that lower end of that spectrum is what the assailant is looking like in terms of demographics. And then in terms of the attacker themselves, another thing that we look at is the resolution of these events. So it's somewhere around 40% of school active assailant events are actually ended by unarmed teachers, administrators, staff members, and students that made the very personal decision that they were going to confront that assailant. And the large majority of those are them actually physically subduing the assailant. Total, whether it's before law enforcement response or after, it's about an equal number, somewhere around 45% that decide to self-terminate. But if we examine self-termination and under the conditions that occurred, the self-termination is really happening under three primary conditions. The first is that there are no more apparent victims in the immediate area. The second is that the assailant has experienced active resistance from one of their victims. And then the third is that they believe that they're going to be taken into custody. So even in the incidents where law enforcement is arriving, as soon as that attacker meets someone with equal or greater means to resist, they're self-terminating. Only 7% of these incidents are actually ended by law enforcement shooting and killing the suspect. Why? Because they're not determined. Mm-hmm. They're not committed to the fight. They don't have the ability to continue to the fight in these K-12 incidents. So when we look at school active shooter events, and this is another key component as well, they are low probability, high consequences, or high impact. Meaning, really, if you look at the data and the amount of schools and the amount of students, the likelihood of being involved in a school active shooter event, it's almost a statistical anomaly. But that's only one equation of doing a risk assessment. The other part of the equation is what are the consequences? And not just consequences in loss of life or injury. What are the consequences for continuity of services? What are the emotional consequences? How does that attack now impact the entire community? A lot of times with these schools, you have schools that they will destroy entire wings of buildings or completely shut down a site entirely following an incident. So when we look at the consequences, they're much greater. I actually start my doctorate's program next month, and one of the things that I'm going to be specifically looking at is comparing the number of students killed in schools from active shooter events compared to pretty much all other natural disasters combined. So we're talking tornadoes, earthquakes, fires, hurricanes, and looking at that data to show, yes, these are much less frequently, but my hypothesis is that the consequences are much greater in terms of loss of life than even natural disasters.
Yeah, and anyone close to it, as you know from your own personal experience, will have some kind of emotional trauma, most likely for the rest of their lives.
When we're looking at the psychological impact of these incidents, unfortunately, we've seen those impacts over the past couple of weeks. What we've had two students from Marjory Stoneman Douglas who survived that attack take their own lives. And we've also had a father of a student that was lost at Sandy Hook take his own life. And what's really unfortunate, all three of those are extremely tragic, but with the father of the daughter, he was actually studying the neuroscience, the data on the brain of individuals that become mass shooters and how we can look at different techniques in prevention or at least identification of these individuals by studying the brain as well. So it's just been extremely tragic how these incidents impact families for just decades after they happen.
Yeah, so I'm wondering what people who you've presented your information to, what has been the reaction, positive and negative from people who conduct training for active shooter response?
We've had incredible feedback from law enforcement. Specifically, what we're trying to do is two things. One, help them understand that if they're being invited in by schools, that it's not as simple as coming in and saying you can run, you can hide, you can fight. That you need to look at what you're actually asking them to do. For example, if you're telling people they need to escape from campus, well, does their infrastructure actually allow them to escape? Are the exterior gates, are they locked by a chain lock? Are they a push bar? And the reason that's important, because if I'm a trainer going in and a teacher says, okay, you're asking me to lock my door, but actually my door doesn't lock, or I have to get on the outside to use a key. If you're not able to at least address those, I'm not expecting law enforcement to be the ones that actually provide those solutions. But if you can't address those concerns, you're going to lose buy-in from your audience, and they're going to lose confidence in your ability as, essentially an authority in this area. So it's important to understand that K-12 facilities are so unique. It has to be site-specific. We have to look at the demographics of the students in terms of their age and their ability. Is it a special education teacher I'm talking to? There's just a lot of different factors to take into account. The second thing that we're really trying to reinforce all the way down to the patrol officer level is you can win this fight. That there is no time for you to hesitate. You don't even have time to pop your trunk and grab your patrol rifle or throw on your body armor. You need to get in there and you need to end this threat as quickly as possible. You need to follow the trail of violence. The expectation isn't that you're searching every single room. You need to make contact and end that threat as quickly as possible. And then in terms of emergency personnel, there's no time for them to wait. They need to get in there and start assessing casualties as quickly as possible. And the challenge that we have within the law enforcement and emergency community is that we haven't differentiated between K-12 active shooter incidents and terrorist attacks or workplace violence. Or if you have incidents specifically like the one in Dallas where the assailant was targeting uniformed personnel. We've mixed all of those different situations together, and what it's done is it's hurt our ability to respond, and it is arguably even a contributing factor to the amount of killed and wounded in these incidents.
So it's just a great idea, when you're analyzing data to get specific and notice, maybe people didn't realize that there could be such stark differences, depending on location and the type of mass casualty incident. But it's great that you've kind of focused in on this and then kind of pointed these out.
Yeah, the data absolutely has to drive not just our training, but also our tactics and techniques. We have to make sure that we're not just using our own opinions or we're just evolving with the threats that are presented. Some of the pushback or some of the other considerations for this is, I mentioned earlier that there's only been one officer wounded, but that's not to say that emergency personnel haven't been targeted. We've seen specifically in Columbine where they did have or attempted to place explosives. San Bernardino, obviously that's a terrorist attack, but they also had explosive present, hasty IEDs in order to target those responding personnel. So it's not to say that those aren't considerations or that they're not going to happen. It's just to say that if we look at the data, it hasn't been effective. And especially if we're looking at K-12 incidents, of course they're not going to become explosive experts because they don't have the ability to test and to develop that craft for it to be effective. We've seen other incidents where we were not positive whether or not the assailant planned on continuing the attack, but there's evidence that there was at least some level of planning or consideration. Sandy Hook is a great example of this, where there was a shotgun in that suspect's vehicle in the parking lot. So he self-terminated, but what you can look at that and say is, well, maybe he did plan on continuing the attack or to transfer the attack to another location or target responding personnel. So those are some of the considerations. We're not talking absolutes here, but we have to look at the data and the evidence, and we have to use that data in order to drive best practices.
So we'll just finish up here. Morgan, really appreciate you coming on the program. What can people do, or how could they find out more information about the work you've done, or anything else related?
My passion is just getting the word out. If individuals are interested in learning about some of the data that I've collected, I am more than happy to provide any of that research for them, any of those resources for them. They can reach me at morgan@dmbconsultants.us. That's David Mike Bravo consultants.us. I'm also on Twitter at Campus Safety Dad. And we are here to support our community. What we want to do is we just want to get the message out. We want people to start to think critically, to develop a conceptual understanding of the uniqueness of K-12 active shooter incidents. And really, at the end of the day, my mission is to change national policy. I don't have small ambitions at all. I want to change national policy and start to adjust and mandate schools to train to an options-based response, to change policies in both law enforcement and emergency response personnel's tactics when it comes to K-12 active shooter incidents. And you mentioned earlier, I'm a United States Marine. We don't fail our missions. And I have devoted my life to this, and I will do everything I can to get that information out there and start to change some of those mindsets, so that way we can keep our kids and our educators safe.
All right. Thanks again for coming, and good luck in the future.
John, thank you so much. Thank you for what you do.
This has been the Prepared Warrior Podcast. For more info on our guests or other episodes, check out thepreparedwarrior.com. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for the Prepared Warrior Podcast, email JON@thepreparedwarrior.com.